Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to give everyone just a minute to hop on and get settled. All right. Well, thank you everyone so much for joining us today for our California Outdoor Recreation Town Hall. My name is Tanya Lownhecht. I'm the Communications Director for Outdoor Alliance. Our office is based in DC, but thanks to the strange times, I am currently living with family out in Sonoma County in California. So I'm actually the newest registered voter in California's 2nd District, which makes me especially thrilled to be here with Congressman Huffman today. Although we're gathering virtually, I did want to acknowledge the background of California's public lands and waters, which are home to more than 100 tribes with more indigenous people than any other state in the country. And because this area is new to me, I had the opportunity to learn about the land that I'm on, which is the traditional land of the Kashaya Band of Pomo Indians, who are the first inhabitants in the area and were forced inland 150 years ago and only recently returned to the coast, where they continue to steward land just a few miles south of here. I'm really looking forward to today's conversation, and I'm so glad you all are able to join us. We have a really wonderful group of folks today who are leading outdoor recreation and conservation issues in California, and there's a lot to discuss in the next hour, including recent successes like the Great American Outdoors Act, climate issues, which I know are top of mind for everyone experiencing this wildfire season, land and ocean conservation, COVID and equitable access issues, and lots of opportunities for conservation and recreation policy in the next Congress. So to give you a quick lay of the land today for what to expect, after introductions, we're hoping to have a really open-ended conversation about where the outdoor community has been successful in its advocacy efforts in California, what we hope to accomplish in the next few years, and how all of us, from businesses like Patagonia to individuals like many of you joining us today, to grassroots organizations, to elected officials, can help move the needle on conservation issues. So we'll also save some time at the end for questions from all of you tuning in. So before we launch into introductions, I wanted to do just a little bit of Zoom housekeeping. First, we'll be recording this session, and once it's live and posted, I will send it out via email to everyone who has registered for the webinar. Second, I'd like to encourage you to participate via 2 different functions. If you're not familiar with Zoom yet, I envy you. If you're new, the chat function at the bottom, there's a little chat bubble if you want to have conversation. And there's also a really nice question and answer function. It says Q&A, and there's 2 chat bubbles. If you'd like to ask questions, we'll save some time at the end. Please put your questions in that little Q&A bucket at the bottom. And then one other small thing is, if you can't see all the speakers at once, there you can toggle at the top right to say gallery view instead of speaker view if you'd like to see everyone. And then before we all start talking and do intros, I actually would love to ask a few questions of everyone joining us today with a couple polls that we put together. So let me see if I can get these to work. So first, the first poll, can you all see this? It should say, what state are you joining us from? So we'll give everyone just a minute to vote so that you all know where everyone is coming from. All right, so ending the poll. Hopefully you can all see this, but if not, I'll read it. 85% of people from California, 15% from out of California. All right, and then a couple more. This asks, if you're in California, are you joining from the 2nd District? All right, one more second. And a lot of people who don't know, you can look this up online. Some yes, 70% no. That's interesting. I hope my parents who are watching inside know that they are in the second district. And then finally, last question. What are you most interested to discuss today? And you can, in this one, you can select multiple options. All right, I'll give you all another few seconds and then share the results. So the Great American Outdoors Act, it's a top thing to discuss today. Most people want to talk about climate. 38% want to talk about wildfires, 35% COVID and recreation, more than half equitable access, more than half California land protections. And then if you have others, you can add them to the questions. Great. So thank you all participants for sharing your thoughts. And then I'd love to have each of the panelists go ahead and introduce themselves. We'll go in alphabetical order. So we'll start with Hans and then Jennifer, then Marcella, and then I'll introduce our special guest, Representative Huffman, at the end. So Hans, would you kick things off by introducing yourself?
Sure. Thanks so much. Hans Cole, really honored to be here today. And just to start off, wanted to say thanks so much to Congressman Huffman, his staff, and the Outdoor Alliance in particular for putting this together. And also just really honored to share this panel with Surfrider and Conservation Lands Foundation. I'm the Director of Environmental Campaigns and Advocacy at Patagonia. We're a California company and have been for 40 years, based just on the other side of Los Angeles in Ventura. We care deeply about using business as a means to save our planet, to save our home planet, and thinking about land and water protection and climate and all the good issues that go into that, as well as thinking about how our communities need to connect with those issues. So really honored to be here today and looking forward to it.
Thank you, Hans.
Hi, Jennifer Savage. I'm the California Policy Manager for Surfrider Foundation. I'm super stoked to be here and really grateful to be part of this fantastic panel. Surfrider Foundation is dedicated to the protection and enjoyment, that's important, of the world's ocean, beaches, and waves. In my role, I work largely on statewide issues around coastal preservation and climate change, beach access, and various types of ocean protection. And so that encompasses a lot of state agency meetings and prior to COVID, a lot of time in Sacramento. Now it's just a lot of phone calls to Sacramento, which is fine because I have the great pleasure of living up in the far north of California in Humboldt County, which makes me also a constituent of Congressman Huffman's. So yeah, lucky on many fronts. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Maricela Rosales. I also go by Marcy, she, her, hers. I'm based out in Los Angeles, California, land of the Tongva people. I'm the California Associate Program Director for Conservation Lands Foundation, and I am honored to be here with everyone on this panel. Thank you for your time. I'm really excited. Conservation Lands Foundation is a national organization that serves to protect, restore, and expand the national landscapes. The system started in 2000 by Secretary Bruce Babbitt and codified in Congress in 2009. And the national lands have been such an important piece to preservation and conservation efforts. And there are about 35 million acres and contain some of the most spectacular scenic, natural, cultural, archaeological sites in the country. And you know, CLF has built a national movement that it's a community-based advocates through our Friends Grassroots Network. And so we have about 70 groups focused on local advocacy that transforms the national impact of national conservation lands that are managed by the Bureau of Land Management. And my focus is on Southern California's desert conservation lands. And so I am here today to talk about desert conservation lands, the importance of public lands and access, and really tying in the climate approach to sustainability.
Thank you all so much. And I am delighted to be able to introduce our special guest, Congressman Jared Huffman, my new congressman. Congressman Huffman represents California's 2nd Congressional District, which spans the north coast of the state from the Golden Gate Bridge to the Oregon border. He was first elected to Congress in November 2012 and currently serves on the Committee of Natural Resources, the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure, and the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. Congressman Huffman is a champion for the outdoors, recreation, and conservation issues, and is an active outdoor enthusiast himself. Recently, his efforts to fund public lands and waters were instrumental to the passage of the Great American Outdoors Act, which will provide billions in funding for public lands and waters. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Tanya. It's great to be with all of you. And welcome to the 2nd Congressional District.
Thank you. Yeah, it's good to be back in California. Thanks.
If you're just north of the Kashaya Reservation, that tells me that you're on the coast of Sonoma County, just north of one of the fires we're tracking right now, the Myers Fire, which thankfully is pretty much under control now.
Yep.
You probably have some pretty smoky air, and we have 2 other major fires in this part of my district that we're keeping a close eye on.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's also an amazing sense of geography, because the Kashaya tribe it's a pretty small area.
But it's a beautiful spot. I've been to that reservation, and it's lovely. So you picked a good place to land.
Thanks. I know we want to talk about wildfires, but I actually wanted to start by talking a little bit about the Great American Outdoors Act. This was a culmination of years of work from you and your colleagues, although there are certainly lots of people who wanted to jump in at the last minute and are eager to take credit. We know over the years there was an element of resistance from members of Congress to getting this done, and it seems like the outdoor community really made so much noise on this bill that it became politically untenable to oppose it. Can you talk a little bit about lessons we can take away from the Great American Outdoors Act, how it got passed, that we can apply to future efforts?
Yeah, so thank you for that. And I think the short story is know your strength. And what we've seen from this experience is that you have maybe more strength than you even thought you had, because for years, full funding and permanent appropriation of the Land and Water Conservation Fund has been a bit of a holy grail. I've been working on it for a long time. I suspect everybody on this call has been working toward that goal. And we know how important the Land and Water Conservation Fund is, right? If you look at the priority list just for this fiscal year 2020 for my district, we're talking about tens of millions of dollars in places that range from the Humboldt Bay National Wildlife Refuge to the Sanhedrin and Trinity Alps Wilderness. This is a very, very important program. And funding it, making sure those dollars that come in from offshore drilling royalty primarily go back out to the environment, which has been the deal for over half a century. That's critically important. So how did we get to the point where all of a sudden Donald Trump and all of these Republicans with terrible environmental records who have been fighting us in these efforts year after year to get this done, suddenly declared themselves conservation champions and got on board this deal that made it happen? Well, it is not the benevolence of their environmental values. It is raw, cold-blooded politics. And this is where, I think you just need to know your power, because as they've been doing all these other rotten things on the environment, and as we speak, the Trump administration is trying to drill in the Arctic refuge. They're acting like they're champions against the Pebble Mine, but the truth is they revived that permit that was killed under the Obama administration and had fast-tracked this terribly destructive environmental atrocity, and it would have been approved, but for the fact that some people personally close to Donald Trump himself intervened and said, don't do it. So let's not mistake any of these actions as enlightened environmental stewardship or good government. These are cold-blooded political calculations. And senators like Steve Daines and Cory Gardner, who have terrible, abysmal lifetime environmental voting records, they saw the light because they're in tough races right now. They know how their constituents feel about our public lands. They know how much support there is out there because of the work that the Outdoor Alliance and others have done in recent years. And so they had to pivot. So I congratulate you for all the hard work that went into this, but don't for a minute mistake their votes and their recent posturing as genuine commitment to our public lands or to our environment. I think we got to know who we're really dealing with here.
Yeah, yeah, that's well said. So I know that Hans, maybe you can speak a little bit about land conservation efforts and the intersection with climate change, because I know we're thinking about that a lot when it comes to the Great American Outdoors Act.
Sure. And, first of all, I just wanted to say thanks, Congressman, for acknowledging that, both the win and the political reality of Great America Outdoors Act. I think that was, Land and Water Conservation Fund was probably the first thing I ever lobbied on 12 years ago, the first time I ever went to the Hill, and we've been working on it since then. So it has been a long haul, but I do think of it as a win too, in spite of the challenges of the political environment that you were describing. The fact that we as a community with great allies like yourself have convinced folks on the Hill that, man, this is something they need to pay attention to. This is something their constituencies care about. So I'd say that's a huge win. I guess, I am really, really interested. I know Patagonia is particularly interested in the overlap between sort of protecting lands and waters and great policy like LWCF and addressing climate change, and how those spaces, are more and more, I think folks are recognizing that they're not two separate parts of the environmental world here or the conservation world, but they really should coexist. And there's probably, some good argument to be made that land and water conservation should be a pillar of addressing the climate crisis. And yeah, I guess I'd bounce it back to you, Congressman, or anybody else on the panel, but I think this is something we're really keen to see folks realize more. I'm wondering, kind of like the Great American Outdoors Act was such an opportunity and such a win recently. How else do you think, Congressman, or again, colleagues here, how can we lean in on that and find more ways to think of land and water conservation as a way to address climate and have it all kind of come together in that one power stroke?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. There's two things I'll say in response to that, Hans. One is they absolutely go hand in glove. You cannot solve the climate crisis unless you are protecting vast areas of land and keeping fossil fuel reserves in the ground. When you look at some of our fights for public land protection, like these national monument designations that occurred under the Antiquities Act, the Trump administration's efforts to undo that have been driven, we know, by oil and gas interests that want to actually develop those places. So that's what's at stake. And some of the most pristine places, I mentioned the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, they are in the crosshairs of oil and gas development. When we protect these beautiful public places, we also keep fossil fuel reserves in the ground, but we also create areas that are going to be necessary for drawing down carbon. It's not enough just to limit the amount that we emit going forward. We've got to start going negative mid-century, and the only way we're going to do that is if we have vast areas that will have to include our public lands that are managed in a way with healthy forests and healthy rangelands where we're actually becoming carbon sinks and drawing down carbon. But the last thing I'll mention, because I think this question kind of invites us to think about this, it is great, this victory we've just won with the Great American Outdoors Act, but the funding mechanism for the Land and Water Conservation Fund is fossil fuel development. So it also challenges us to think long-term. We don't want to be dependent forever on what has to be a declining revenue stream. If that revenue stream doesn't decline, we're all screwed, right? We need less royalties from oil and gas development because we just need to stop extracting and burning so much fossil fuel. So as we celebrate this victory, we're going to have to start thinking about the long-term replacement for those oil and gas royalties. We're going to have to make sure that clean energy development, which can happen on our public lands and off the Outer Continental Shelf in ways that are consistent with our environmental values and consistent with access and recreation, they're going to need to be part of the funding solution that replaces, I think, that funding stream. And we'll have to think creatively about other ways to do it too.
Can I jump in? Thank you, Congressman, and thanks, Hans, for bringing that up. I think we're seeing just more and more how interlinked all these issues are. And in thinking about the Land Water Conservation Fund, and Congressman Huffman mentioned the Humboldt Bay National Wildlife Refuge, which is just across the bay from me, and a really incredible place. And it's not just like about that preservation, but it's these estuaries and the dunes around the bay are really key when it comes to climate change adaptation, right? They serve to protect us as sea level rise comes. The protection and the restoration of the dunes and the wetlands plays a really important role in helping us adapt as seas rise. And on top of that, they serve as places people can go for enjoyment. With COVID, certainly, I mean, we've seen so many people just desperate to be outside because it's one of the places where you can be pretty safe, and anxiety, so there's mental and physical health benefits that all come in. So access is so important as part of this conversation. All of these fit together. And your second point, Congressman, as they're working on their draft strategic managing our public lands, is funded by oil and gas leases. And so I think this is a conversation that's echoing throughout the country in different ways as we move off the fossil fuel.
Maricela, I'm hoping you'll speak a little bit to 30 by 30 efforts. And maybe you could explain the background of that just a little bit for folks who might not be familiar with it.
Yeah, so I kind of want to go into what Congressman Huffman and Hans and Jennifer mentioned, and how everything is interconnected, and how we need to look at it also at a micro level. And when we're looking at rural communities, how does LWCF play a part into this language of 30 by 30? How do we expose communities to green and open spaces? How do we build upon that? And that in itself is, when we look at how this money is being allocated, some of it's going to local parks, some of it's going to building recreational areas, or revamping and revitalizing these areas that have been lacked in terms of funding. And that opportunity arises with the funding that's going to be given in the next 5 years. I mean, from what I understand, the Great American Outdoors Act, it's been a long time waiting. And I know, very similar to Hans, when I started my advocacy efforts, I started with LWCF and learning about it. And I'm one of the, I guess, younger/older millennials that got in tune with advocacy later in life, and understanding these concepts. And they need to be more digestible for the community. And when we're looking at communities, we need to first connect with people, understand what their needs are before we push policy, and before we even connect them to the lands, because a lot of people cannot access them. There isn't a system of transit to trails to certain areas. Even in rural communities, even though that their backyards are green and open spaces, just the lack of information and accessibility is not there. So it's really an understanding of the social justice piece and how that plays into environmental justice and conservation. Even the word conservation itself is a controversial amongst BIPOC communities because of what it stands for, and how we can change that traditional narrative is going to take some time. And so when we're looking at the 9.5 billion that we're going to receive in the next 5 years from development revenue, we need to also make sure that it is written and it is sustainable when we're talking about these things, and really implementing the work. Because I feel, coming in conservation, it seems performative. We want to be actionable, we want to be intentional, we want to be authentic. And in order to be generationally relevant and culturally relevant with what we need for 30 by 30, we need to address it with the Great American Outdoors Act, and make sure that the agencies that we're working with are really putting that money to good use for the right reasons for our communities. And so with 30 by 30, I mean, that's something that I'm also learning as I go on in my role with Conservation Lands Foundation. It's something that for a long time with other groups that I've worked with has been a very sensitive topic to talk about climate change. It's very hard to understand it when you're looking at the language of biodiversity and the messaging behind science. It needs to be more digestible, and that's something that as communities of color and indigenous communities, we need to be at the forefront. We need to be consulted. We need to have that conversation when we're talking about what it means to protect 22%, what it means to protect 8%, so that California is at 30% of protecting land by 2030. So I want to be able to, learn as time goes on. And I know that even AB 3030 was not successful last week. And that's something that we need to look at when we're looking at what that messaging looks like. Why aren't we pushing access more? As it pertains to, yes, we're adding biodiversity into the AB 3030 language. We're adding the science behind it, but really we need to push the tribal consultant perspective, and we also need to push the accessibility perspective. If we really want us to be a broader demographic of advocates, we need to have an authentic reach that is not just pushing on these larger efforts, but really meeting the needs of the community first before we get to 30 by 30.
Well, and can I suggest it's also very important when we think about these big ambitious efforts like 30 by 30. And I didn't follow AB 3030 all that closely, but I do know that it broke down in part because the alliance, the coalition, could and should have included recreational and other fishing interests that felt shut out and not talked to and not considered. So it's really important. There is a really broad coalition, I think, for good protective stewardship of our land and water. But we can't forget the people who make their living on the water and who recreate on the water.
Yeah, I would say that, we have one thing with Surfrider and our work on access, historically, we have been very focused on physical barriers. A lot of people are familiar with Martin's Beach, where a billionaire put up a gate and blocked historical access to the beach. And these, even the term historical is kind of inhabited this coast for. In the past few years, we've really taken a focus on the intangible barriers as well, and it's been a real learning process. But to get to the coast, who live places it's hot, our coast is probably unaffordable, but just getting there is such a burden, and it really impacts people's ability to experience it, which then affects how they feel maybe about protecting it and engaging.
Mm-hmm.
Just to bring up one more piece too, I appreciate, Maricela, you bring the conversation in this direction and kind of with the discussion here. I think, another thing in addition to access that I know Patagonia has been working on in various land and water conservation efforts that we're part of, but also want to do more with is, where can we follow the lead of sort of tribal-led, indigenous-led, First Nations-led conservation efforts, where if conservation is the wrong word, what do we even call them? Or, how do we work together with folks who, as sort of we did land acknowledgements earlier, who occupied this land and whose land it is, ancestral homelands for thousands of years. And, are there sort of projects and places where we can lean in on that in California too? I know that the Klamath Project has had significant and, absolutely critically led elements by tribes that are involved up there. I'm pretty familiar with Yurok involvement on the Klamath effort. But yeah, really, really keen also to see that aspect of this whole world of sort of land and water protection be elevated.
Thanks for mentioning Klamath. That is an absolute poster child of the kind of situation where the West has largely been developed by outsourcing all the impacts and the costs of our development onto tribes and communities of color. The downstream Yurok, Karuk, and to some degree the Hoopa Valley tribe have borne all the impacts of that project. It's operated since 1954 on a hydro license that doesn't include any mitigation. I mean, not even the most basic rudiments of fish passage or water quality protection. And it's just wreaking havoc on the Klamath River and on everybody downstream. So we've got a major corporation, Pacific Core, owned by Warren Buffett and Berkshire Hathaway, who has the chance to do the right thing, but they are dragging their feet. They're backpedaling. They're suggesting that maybe they'll just continue to operate it the same way they've done since 1954. And we have to make clear that that's totally unacceptable.
Well, thanks for your leadership on that one too, Congressman. It's great. It's, so thankful to have that in your district, because it's such a complicated project. But as you say, so many communities are impacted, and the recreation community as well. Those rivers, the fish,
Yeah.
All those areas up there. I think it's really, really hopeful that can keep moving forward with good leadership.
Yeah, thank you.
Speaking of other bills that we want to see moving forward, we are really excited about the Northwest California Wilderness Recreation and Working Forest Acts, and are so grateful for all your great work on that. I know that you and your colleagues recently got it attached to the National Defense Authorization Act, which was a really big deal. We're over the moon about it. Can you talk a little bit about what the path forward looks like, how people can help, how companies like Patagonia, groups like Outdoor Alliance, Surfrider, Conservation Alliance Foundation can help move it forward?
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks for that. And this isn't the way they teach you to legislate in Schoolhouse Rock, and starts as a bill and all this stuff. They need a new verse that says when you pass it out of the House with bipartisan support and it won't even get a vote in the Senate, then you look for a must-pass defense bill and you jam it in. And that's what we did with the defense authorization bill. So the good news is our inclusion of all of these great public lands bills in the NDAA did not spook a lot of Republican votes. We still got a pretty solid bipartisan vote out of the House on a defense bill that included all this good public land protection. So I think that puts us in a good negotiating posture versus the Senate when it comes to the conference committee and coming up with a final NDA that still includes these elements. And we've got good support on the House side, because some pretty senior members of the House, like Adam Schiff, he's got a Southern California wilderness bill in there, I think, involving the Santa Monica Mountains. And I think it's just a matter of holding our ground, and the Outdoor Alliance could be a huge part of making sure that this stays in the NDAA. It's weird, and again, it doesn't seem like clean civics to be legislating this way, but the Republicans do it all the time when it comes to using NDAA to gutting ESA protections for sage grouse or prairie chickens or whatever. So I think we can't be purists about this. We have an opportunity to do something really good for public lands. And for my district, this bill of mine that many of you have helped me work on is really big. And it's creative and it's innovative. It certainly includes lots of wilderness and wild and scenic river protections, but it's more than that. It includes a lot of recreation, new trails, visitors centers, possible lodging for Redwood National Park. And it includes a really large area we've set aside as a working forest, because we've got some very unhealthy forest in the South Fork Trinity and the Mad River watershed. It is very prone to catastrophic fire. We're going to have to do some smart thinning and clearing. We can do that in a way that raises revenue to invest in coho salmon restoration and marijuana grow site cleanups and other things that we have to do in those watersheds. So it's really a pretty well-conceived it's not just wilderness, it's a pretty broad, thoughtful public lands bill, and I'm excited about it.
Yeah, we are too.
You just have to sweep the forest. Won't that fix it?
Raking. Yeah, we don't have a raking provision in this bill, so we'll have to hope it passes in spite of that.
Jennifer, I know you're working closely on climate efforts, and was hoping you would ask the Congressman some questions about his other climate efforts.
Sure. Well, maybe we could talk about the climate crisis plan a bit. And I know that for me, one of the takeaways in there was the acknowledgement that that it's a broad-based solution. There's a lot of different sectors that will need to change and be addressed and be sector specific. I think people look for this one big solution. So so maybe if you wanted to share some of the things that you think we should pay the most attention to, that'd be great.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm real pleased to have been part of the Climate Crisis Select Committee. We spent about 15 months having all sorts of hearings and meetings, and the culmination of our work was rolled out a couple of months ago. It's this 500+ page action plan that does something Congress hasn't ever tried to do before, which is to look at the entire economy and the whole of government and come up with a comprehensive roadmap for getting to the place that the IPCC tells us we must be at by mid-century, which is net negative emissions by 2050. Then we've got to draw down and go truly negative after that. And so we wanted to put us on a roadmap to do all of that. And so that's why it looks at everything. It doesn't just go after the electricity sector, although it includes some really ambitious stuff there. It doesn't just go after transportation, although it's really strong on that. It goes after everything and includes natural systems. So this is something that I think is a great fit for my district and for some of your interests. I alluded earlier to the way public lands could be managed in a way that become part of the climate solution instead of part of the problem, which they are now. We generate an awful lot of fossil fuels on our public lands right now. That needs to stop. But we also need to manage them differently, more thoughtfully. Fire is something we could talk about. Fire is a natural part of the ecosystem. Healthy forests have fire, and actually, the paradox is we need to use fire more as part of our response to having less of these catastrophic blowout fires that we're dealing with year after year in California. That's not sustainable. And it's because in part because we've abandoned and actually discouraged natural uses of fire. So all of that is discussed in the Climate Action Plan. Our oceans feature pretty prominently in there, not just because oceans are hugely impacted by climate change, but because they can be part of the solution. Offshore clean energy, if it's appropriately sited, Surfrider is going to make sure we're thoughtful about how we do offshore wind and wave energy and things like that. But it has the potential to be a great part of this transition to clean energy. And then blue carbon. Those beautiful trees behind you, Jen, manage carbon really well. But believe it or not, mangroves and seagrass and salt marsh can sequester even more carbon. And it's sort of a twofer because they provide a natural buffer for our resiliency needs with rising sea levels and extreme weather. So all of that is part of our policy recommendations. It's really pretty exciting for environmental policy wonks like all of us, and I hope you'll all give it a read when you're not watching, night 2 of the RNC convention.
It's not going to happen.
47 pages. Exactly.
Congressman Huffman, I have a question with the climate crisis plan. Are you considering the desert as part of a means to be part of the climate plan?
Well, certainly in the sense that a lot of renewable energy can be generated in the desert if it has to be thoughtfully sited. If there are other aspects of desert protection and management that should be in there, I'd love to hear more about that. But I think just getting the fossil fuel stuff out, carefully siting clean energy, I think our desert can do that for us.
Absolutely. And, when I'm thinking about what, drives a lot of communities is money. And when I think about public lands, I think about outdoor recreation and that economy and how much it has given so much more to public lands than the fossil fuel industry. So, It's great that we have the Great American Outdoors Act. We're talking about 30 by 30 climate action. And, this is an opportunity to enter green energy and provide so many more jobs to Americans who are struggling right now, and to provide opportunities for people to enter into outdoor recreation and environmental jobs more than ever before.
Yeah, so you all know what a big part of the economy is. That is in my district, it's just huge. I don't have the numbers at my fingertips, but it's in the hundreds of millions of dollars. But the other piece of this that is in our climate action plan as well is the restoration economy. There's big jobs in that, and we've just got a lot of degraded lands from extractive industries and neglect and mismanagement that will benefit from bringing back the Civilian Conservation Corps and making those types of investments as well.
Congressman, you know, one of the things that I have found working as an activist on these huge issues that often fill people with despair is having examples of successes to point to. And I know we're talking about the Great American Outdoors Act, and that's clearly a success, but are there some tangible projects or other forms of protection that you would point to as a thing that this seemed really hard, but it got done and it's good and it will have benefits into the future?
Oh yeah, yeah. Thanks for that question. Sometimes when we fight these big battles and have these big wins, the wins are never permanent. You have to like fight them all over again every few years when someone tries to undo them. But one that comes to mind immediately, I spent a number of years when I was an attorney at NRDC fighting to restore flows to the San Joaquin River below Friant Dam. This is a 153-mile section of California's second longest river that was totally dried up. I mean, literally just turned into sand. And it used to be one of the largest salmon runs on the entire West Coast, massive spring run salmon population. So for a half century, it was sand. And thanks to a lot of litigation and an incredible effort by this coalition and some creativity in negotiating a deal with water users down there, we got a deal. Water is now flowing in the San Joaquin River. Those spring run salmon are returning and spawning, and their juvenile progeny are out migrating, and got a lot of restoration work to do in the years ahead because that river is still in pretty bad shape. But it is inspiring and dramatic to see what's going on, and that's a great example. The Klamath River is going to be another example. These 4 hydro dams aren't even needed. We can more cost effectively find that power in other ways, but if we take them out, water quality is going to improve dramatically. Some of the highest concentrations of toxic blue-green algae on the planet are created in one of those dams behind, I believe it's Iron Gate or Copco, one of those 2 dams. And there's just no way to fix it. You can't build a fish ladder or do anything to fix it unless you take them out and have free-flowing river, which is great for all of your outdoor enthusiasts who would like to kayak and fish and hike in those river valleys, but it'll also be great for everyone downstream. And you know, just offshore of you, Jen, there's a bunch of orca whales that love to eat salmon, and they're in really bad shape because we have wrecked the salmon runs on the Klamath River. So I can't yet hold that out as one of the victories that would, you know, lift us up from the pit of despair, but we're really close. And if we can get Pacific Corps to follow through on its commitments, it's going to be one of the shining examples of success.
Absolutely. It's going to be a huge party. I can't wait.
I'd love to pivot to some questions from participants now, so we save a little time for that. But encourage the panelists to hop in if they have answers or also additional questions. I want to start with a question from Laurel, who asks, Congressman Huffman, the Mendocino, Six Rivers, Shasta Trinity, Rogue Siskiyou, and Klamath National Forests will be undergoing their forest management plan revisions together imminently. What would you like to see in those management plans, and in particular, anything specific to outdoor recreation?
That's a great question. Well, I certainly want to hear from this community that I'm talking to right now about what the priorities should be in those national forest units. My bill has several things that would call upon some of those national forest units to do things a little new and differently. Looking at a visitor center in Trinity County, looking at the possibility of some new trails, working closely with collaboratives like the Trinity Collaborative on some projects that are great for forest health and resilience and fire safety as well. So I'll be looking for those kind of things and listening to you in all of those forest units on what you want to see.
Thank you. Another question has come in from Rose. She says, I appreciate all the bills that the House has passed this legislative session on many issues of importance to Americans. Now that the Climate Crisis Committee has produced recommendations, when can we expect actual legislation to combat the climate crisis? And which aspects of the report do you expect to work on first?
Yeah. So we have a plan. Plans are nice, but action is even better, and legislation is one way to have that action. So some of that has begun. You may know that the House of Representatives passed, after talking about infrastructure, since the dawn of time, after I don't know how many times President Trump declared Infrastructure Week and nothing ever happened, we finally passed a really big infrastructure package out of the House of Representatives, $1.5 trillion, called the Moving Forward Act. And it reflects an awful lot of things that were in the Climate Action Plan, and that's no coincidence. We've been working with the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, with the Energy and Commerce Committee, on all sorts of things, from transportation policies to, a electric vehicle charging network nationwide, and all of the clean energy investments we need to make. So some of that's starting to happen. There is some draft legislation taking shape on things like the 30 by 30 protection goal, on other aspects of our ocean climate plans. I know that there are various carbon pricing bills floating around out there. Our climate action plan did not specify the exact carbon pricing mechanism and whether it should be revenue neutral, or if there is revenue positive aspects, what do you do with that revenue? I personally think that the idea of just giving everyone an equal dividend makes no sense. I think we're going to need that money to do all sorts of investments, and also to invest in underserved and frontline communities who need to be, they need to go to the top of the list for those kind of things. But you'll see legislation, I think, on that. The other thing you've seen, though, is, and I say we're starting to move bills out. President Biden, did I say President Biden? Vice President Biden, soon to be President Biden, has a really great climate plan that came out of that Unity Task Force, and reflects an awful lot of consistency with our House Climate Action Plan. We'll see what happens in the United States Senate, but I think almost immediately after the election, if we win back the Senate, if Biden is going to be the next president, we're not going to wait until everybody gets sworn in and there's an inauguration. We're going to go to work immediately as part of a transition to hit the ground running on all this stuff. And you are going to see a flurry of legislation, hopefully in a coordinated way, right? This is the kind of thing that really, if we're going to get this done, we're going to have to work together, and we're going to have to be strategic and smart, but we don't have a lot of time. So don't assume that we wait until January. I think this is a November 4th item.
Yeah. Hans, I know one thing we talked about is you're curious about what companies like Patagonia can do, especially with the election upcoming. I wondered if you'd want to ask Congressman Huffman about that, or speak to that a little bit.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think the elephant in the room here is the elections coming up, and Congressman, you've certainly talked politics a little bit this evening, which has been great. I think Patagonia, just to say first off, we're gonna be very focused on getting our community mobilized to vote, to make a plan to vote. We're going to have resources for that on all of our sort of online channels. We've got a new film out called Public Trust that's going to focus on public lands and try to mobilize voters around that issue. It's happening on September 25th is our digital release of that. So we're trying to mobilize every part of our company to engage our audience. And I also know that, there's real needs out there, like poll workers. We really need to make sure that there's a free and fair election, and that people in frontline communities who are hit hardest by COVID and by all the injustices that we witness, daily are able to get out and vote, that they have places to, to do it, and poll workers there, manning those stations. Vote by mail is huge, obviously, too, and giving people a safe way to get out there and vote. But I guess I just wonder, Congressman, if you have anything else to add in terms of that world of the elections. What should we be thinking about, whether it's get out the vote or whether it's issue oriented? What should we do now? How can we as a community mobilize to make sure that your hopeful vision from a few minutes ago does take place.
Well, thank you for that. And I realize this is an official gathering, not a partisan gathering. So I don't think I've gotten you in trouble by telling anyone how to vote.
You can say what you want, just
yeah,
Marcella, Jennifer, and I cannot.
All right. But just making sure that votes happen and that votes are counted and that it's done safely. You'd think you could almost take that for granted, but not now. We are all going to be battling disinformation and voter suppression in one form or another. So the things you just mentioned, Hans, just making sure that your community understands safe ways to vote, that everybody have an almost individualized voting plan. That's not something we've talked about in prior years. We just kind of scramble and try to, get people out there to vote. But you do need a plan this year because of the pandemic, because of the voter suppression, because of the dirty tricks that are happening out there. And anyone who wants to work on voter turnout and election integrity is going to have to be prepared to just do a massive amount of individualized handholding on the development and execution of these individual voter plans. That's how it's going to be done. Vote early. Vote early. That's maybe the most important piece of it too.
We can all say that.
Vote early and put it in the mailbox early.
Yeah.
Pronto.
Yep.
Absolutely.
At least 10 days. At least 10 days.
I wanted to share another question from Pete, also at Surfrider. He says, thank you, Representative Huffman, for acknowledging that we'll need to find other ways to fund LWCF in the future as we phase out offshore drilling. Can you expand on other possible funding options our community should be considering? We get this question all the time, so I'm really curious to hear your response.
Well, I mentioned renewables, and at this point, I don't like the idea of burdening renewables with too many additional costs and royalties and things like that, because we need to supercharge them to compete and to penetrate the market. But there's going to come a point where we've got to replace that lost fossil fuel revenue, and it's just natural that if we're going to be using our public lands and areas of the outer continental shelf for any kind of energy generation, that they should be paying into something like the Land and Water Conservation Fund. In terms of other revenue sources, it's kind of wild speculation at this point. I haven't figured out exactly how you make up for all of that oil and gas money, but we're all going to have to roll up our sleeves and make it happen. And the other thing we've got to do as we do that, we've got to be really wary about policy traps that create new levels of dependency on fossil fuel revenues. So for example, I have had colleagues with perfectly good intentions propose, well, let's just crank up the royalties on the existing oil and gas we have on public lands and offshore, and let's use that to invest in a just transition in all these communities that are dependent on fossil fuel jobs. Well, you got to be real careful there, because you've got communities like states like New Mexico and Louisiana that fund their schools and their healthcare and these other things from fossil fuel royalty revenues. And so if you're creating more and more dependency on fossil fuel money, it's going to be really hard to get those places to break away. If you're going to take those royalties and as some sort of a phased transition that eventually shuts this stuff down and thoughtfully invest it in things that really are a transition, you got to very carefully define what that just transition looks like, and you got to make sure that you're really getting there and not just creating this, not just perpetuating this dependency.
Yeah, thank you. We have time for one more question, and I want to think about maybe the panelists, maybe Marcella, you'd have some thoughts on this as well. As we think about how many people are getting outside right now, COVID has really underscored that access to the outdoors is not as equitable as we'd like it to be. What are some efforts that we're seeing either through the Great American Outdoors Act or other legislation or programmatic efforts to expand equitable access and think about including tribes and underrepresented communities in funding and restoration efforts?
That's a very
That's a big question to end on.
That's a big question, but I will say from what I know is that with COVID-19, it has really put a damper on all of our lives. And now more than ever, you're starting to see people who are new users going out to the outdoors, to public spaces, to green and open spaces. I think Recreate Responsibly has done really well with promoting the safety measures that you need when you go outside. The issues that arise from that is that a lot of new users are multi-generational, and maybe they're not tech savvy. Maybe, you know, they're receiving their information from their children who are also taking them out. So there are that new user impacts that we're seeing. But we're also seeing that a lot of the work that's being done is at a standstill because the focus is COVID-19 and an administration that is not taking it seriously. So all of us in some way have been scrambling since it all started to really move forward into the work that we want to do is, you know, protect public lands, advocate for access and equitable ways to get to these places, to really diversify these spaces. And so what's great that we're seeing is that on a digital scope, we're seeing amplification of BIPOC voices. We're seeing amplification of bills and organizations building coalitions and working together to really get the message out. It's still a space that is still not as broad, and so the network is slowly expanding, but now more than ever, we need to be able to connect to folks in, for example, in the high desert, and how we are trying to push get out the vote, for example, for Conservation Lands Foundation, focusing on the Inland Empire and seeing how we can get folks that are not necessarily interested in voting, but to be activated in some capacity. So moving away from the digital scope and advertising through radio ads, newspapers, and going back to basics and really trying to tell the story of that these are your places, but then also it's like, what is it that you really need that we can help? So that civic engagement piece is coming back during this time. And it's really exciting to see that all of us are somehow working and navigating the space together, but apart.
Congressman Huffman, do you have any closing thoughts?
No, I appreciate very much hearing that from Maricela and all of your very good questions. I am, in spite of this, you know, weird, surreal, difficult moment that we're all slogging through right now, and you know, I've got thousands of constituents that are evacuated right now, and the fire just added one more layer of difficulty to what was already really tough with the pandemic, with the economic hardship, which is just terrible, not just in my district, but in lots of other places. The one thing that I am just excited about and quite optimistic about is the possibilities I see in this election and after this election. I think as difficult as this moment is right now, it's going to give way to some opportunities that we're all going to have a chance to work on in a big and exciting and wonderful way. And it'll be great for the environment. It'll be responsive to the climate crisis. You know, it sounds trite, but this whole Build Back Better that you're hearing from Joe Biden, that's the opportunity we have. We have an opportunity to build back better. And that's better from a perspective of equity and racial and social justice. It's certainly better in terms of a clean energy economy and solving the climate crisis. And it can be a lot better for these wonderful public places that we all care about that support the outdoor recreation economy. So I'm, as we suffer through these difficult days, I'm also pretty fired up about what lies ahead.
Thank you. What a wonderful note to end on. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to all the panelists and all of you for being here.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you all later. Bye.